Well, greetings, guest. Thank you for coming to this wonderful event. My name is Daniel Philphott. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Delighted to moderate this event on Dr. Elizabeth Foster's new book, African Catholic: Decolonization and the Transformation of the Church. We are honored and grateful to be hosted by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, which exists to educate university students, quote, to give the Republic her best citizens, unquote, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversations between the academy and the public square. So our star guest, the author of the book that we'll be considering, is Dr. Elizabeth A. Foster, who is professor of history at Tufts University in Massachusetts. She is the author of our book of today, African Catholic: Decolonization and the Transformation of the Church, published by Harvard University Press in 2019, which has already won the John Gilmary Shea Prize from the American Catholic Historical Association and received honorable mention for the Religion and International Relations Book Prize from the International Studies Association in 2020. Her first book, Faith and Empire: Religion, Politics, and Colonial Rule in French Senegal, 1880 to 1940, published by Stanford University Press in 2013, won the Alf Andrew Heggoy Book Prize from the French Colonial Historical Society in 2014. She's also co-edited a volume with Udi Greenberg entitled Decolonization and the Remaking of Christianity, 2023, and is published in numerous scholarly journals and has been funded by several prestigious fellowships. Commenting on her book will be Father Gabriel Mmassi, who is a Jesuit priest from Tanzania and a member of the East African province of the Society of Jesus. He completed his doctoral studies in theology at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley and the Catholic University of America. He has taught at Hekima College, Nairobi in Kenya, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and in Ivory Coast, South Africa, and Berkeley, California. Presently, he holds the Endowed Jesuit Chair at Loyola University in Maryland. So let us begin with Professor Foster, who will offer a presentation of her book for about 25 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's an honor to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Everyone can see that, I hope. Okay, it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you. Thanks to John Henry for organizing, to Father Gabriel Mmassi for commenting, and to Dan Philphott for moderating. So in what follows, like Dan said, I'm going to try to speak for between 20 and 25 minutes. And I plan to acquaint you with the central research questions that produced the book, and then go over how it is structured, its main contributions, and the sources I used. I'm going to try to move quickly so that there's plenty of time for discussion. So, African Catholic germinated from questions I had about religion at the end of empire. As Dan mentioned, my first monograph was a history that examined the complex relationships between French Catholic missionaries, the Africans they sought to convert, and French administrative authorities in Senegal between 1880 and 1940. I'm going to show a map of French Africa here to orient everyone. There are 2 federations, 8 colonies in French West Africa, and 4 in French Equatorial Africa. In the context of empire building, a key question for historians has always been whether missionaries were, quote-unquote, handmaidens of colonial rule. Did their religious undertakings pave the way for colonial exploitation? Did they soften the ground for armies or bureaucratic states? Or did they, like Bartolomé de las Casas in the Spanish context, did they defend subject peoples from colonial depredations? So these were the questions I was working on at the beginning of my career. And as I was doing so, I began to wonder what happened afterwards. What happened when colonial rule came to an end? What happened to missions and churches founded and staffed by Europeans when colonial states left Africa beginning in the 1950s? Especially since most of the personnel on the ground were still European, though numbers of converts were starting to grow exponentially. And I just want to gesture at this in the case of French Africa by showing you a couple of slides. These are the archbishops of all of French sub-Saharan Africa in the year 1958, which was the year that the first French African colony, Guinea, became independent. As you can see, there is not an African among them, and a number of them are clearly of an older generation who had spent the bulk of their career, working in Africa under the colonial regime. I want to point out, fifth from the left in the first row, Marcel Lefebvre, who I'm assuming is probably familiar, perhaps to this audience, as for his spectacular break with the papacy in the wake of Vatican II and his arch conservatism and eventual excommunication. He was the most powerful prelate, I would argue, in all of colonial Africa, not just the French part, in the 1940s and 1950s. He was both the Archbishop of Dakar, which was the biggest city and administrative headquarters for French West Africa, but he was also the papal delegate to all of French Africa, including Madagascar and North Africa as well. So he is an important figure in my story, and as you may know, was had a very conservative view of where the church should be heading at mid-century. So here's another slide very quickly. I just want to give you some sense of how many Europeans were still staffing the church in Africa on the eve of independence in Francophone Africa. So you see that there is a large increase of African clergy, and this refers exclusively to African clergymen, between 1952 and 1958. However, there was also a large increase of European clergy in that time, and numbers on the ground were such at independence where the church was still very much reliant on Europeans. So I was curious about how this transition to independence, how the political transition to independence, how that played out in the church. I wanted to know if Catholic missions in Africa successfully disentangled themselves from the colonial order, and whether Catholicism itself, the actual faith, was quote unquote decolonized, and what would that actually mean? And I think hopefully that the import of these questions should be obvious to this audience. Catholicism is now growing faster in Africa than anywhere else on the planet, and its presence there is arguably one of the most important and enduring legacies of contact between Europeans and Africans in the colonial period. My book focuses closely on the period between 1945 and 1965, the end of the Second World War through to the end of the Second Vatican Council, which I see as a crucial time during which the Catholic Church began to pivot away from the colonial past, albeit not without reluctance and difficulty, and set the table for sweeping change that occurred later on. And the other thing I would say is that Africans themselves played very crucial roles in pushing this process forward in this important period. So now I'm going to shift to the book structure that will help me convey to you some of its key contributions. So I had originally envisioned the book as a kind of series of geographic case studies in various locales. And I focused in on Guinea, where Sekou Touré, pictured here, this is the picture on the cover of the book, he's pictured here on the right. He was the first president of independent Guinea. He's sitting here with Raymond Marie Chidimbo, who was the first African Archbishop of Conakry, And Torre had demanded that the Vatican appoint an African archbishop to this post. He did not want a Frenchman in charge of the church in Guinea any longer. And he repeatedly, in the course of his career, attacked the Catholic Church as a bastion of French colonialism. In 1967, in fact, he expelled all French missionaries from Guinea. Here they are at the Conakry airport in 1967. I will note in passing that he ultimately also attacked Chidimbo himself and put him in a labor camp for over 8 years. So I wanted to look at Guinea because that's where it seemed like things really went wrong from the church's perspective. I was also interested, and here I'm at the map again to help orient you, in what happened in Senegal on the west coast and what was known at the time as French Sudan, what we know now as Mali, which were predominantly Muslim territories where there were Catholic minorities, but those Catholic minorities were very influential, particularly in Senegal, where Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was first a deputy from Senegal to the French National Assembly in the immediate post-war period, and then became the first president of independent Senegal in 1960, he was a Catholic and was part of this small Catholic minority. And predominantly Muslim Senegal was the first state in newly independent Africa to establish diplomatic relations with the Vatican. So I was interested in questions around Catholicism and Islam in these contexts. And then finally, I wanted to see how things unfolded in areas such as Togo or further south Gabon, where you had very large Catholic presences. In the end, however, that's not how it worked. As historians often find when they get in the archive, the things are not organized the way you think they are in your own head. And so I ended up organizing the book around conversations and debates that were taking place in a broader Franco-African Catholic world that had been created historically by French conquest, the processes of colonization, Catholic missions, and conversions of Africans. And the people in this world, who by the middle of the 20th century included French clergy in Africa, their superiors in France, African Catholic converts, African clergy, African lay activists and intellectuals, African Catholic students who were studying and living in France, and Catholic fundraisers in France who gathered money for the African missions. All of these people were all preoccupied with the future of France's African colonies, the place of Catholicism in Africa, and whether their personal loyalties should lie with the Vatican, France, or emerging African states in the years following World War II. And this world was knit together by faith, of course, by paths of Catholic education that people took across borders, by missionary organizations, many of whom controlled the seats, the bishoprics in particular colonies. A Francophone Catholic press also was an organ that tied this all together, that also crossed boundaries. And charitable networks were another piece of this. This world has long been overlooked by historians, but I try to bring it to life. And I also argue that it still exists today. Every time I go to an archive of a current missionary society, but looking at their, at their historical archives, I encounter it. Many of the same institutions and circuits persist, but the difference now is that directional flow has completely reversed in the space of 2 generations. Nowadays, it's Francophone Africans who come by the hundreds to staff pulpits in France and to shore up, and indeed often to lead, missionary societies that were founded in Europe, but now have dwindling European personnel because vocations have cratered in France and across Europe as a whole. So The structure of the book thus came to reflect the constituencies and conversations that I found in the archives I consulted. And these included a variety of missionary archives, diplomatic archives, both French and sort of their interaction, France with Africa and with the Vatican, and colonial archives in both Europe and in Africa. And my discoveries have bearing on a number of different scholarly conversations across fields. So I'm going to briefly take you through the chapters and then conclude. So in my first chapter, I set the stage, the sort of political and religious stage in Francophone Africa in the wake of World War II, showcasing key tensions developing on the ground right after the war. So I start with a petition signed by African Catholic youth in Dakar and forwarded to Léopold Senghor, pictured here, who was their deputy in the French National Assembly. These young Africans wanted a French missionary priest whom they considered, and this is their word, a negrophobe, transferred out of their community. Senghor forwarded their petition to the head of the French missionary order at the time, and he wrote, quote, "Unfortunately, missionaries, who were the most liberal Europeans in Africa before the war, failed to comprehend the revolution that the war has wrought in minds and in fact," end quote. He meant that Africans had emerged from the war with a desire to have more say in their own affairs, both in the realm of politics and within the church. The Vatican also wanted to push hard for African progress towards leadership positions in the church after the war. Yet, ironically, after 1944, the French colonial state, which had always been, or for a long time, had been hostile to Catholic missions, there's a long strand of anti-clericalism in French in the French Republic, it became more hospitable to missions than ever before, showering state money on them for schools and for healthcare initiatives, creating closer ties between church and state, just at the moment when the Vatican was starting to think about maybe we should disentangle ourselves from this colonial order. And creating tensions between Vatican officials on the one side, Africans on the other, with French missionaries in the middle, especially older ones, I'm speaking of the missionaries, who proved reluctant to change their attitudes or to cede power to African clergy, even in the face of Vatican orders. The priest, for example, that these parishioners complained about in Dakar remained where he was, supported by Lefebvre, and even became director of the seminary in Senegal for a time before his death in 1957. Moving right along, the second chapter, in this chapter, I engaged the historiography of Black internationalism by showing that there was a vigorous strand, Catholic strand, of the negritude movement that attacked the Catholic Church for racism and Eurocentrism from the inside in the 1950s and 1960s. Its most, and here, this illustrates this perfectly, its most visible proponent was Alioune Diop, a Senegalese Muslim convert to Catholicism who was the behind-the-scenes architect of the negritude movement at mid-century. And I'll explain that further in a second. But you can see it here. We have some of the leading lights. Those of you who are familiar with the negritude movement, French and Francophone literature, we have some of the most renowned intellectuals here. Alioune Diop is at the center, and you see Father Robert Sastre in his cassock on the edge of the picture next to Diop's wife, who was also part of this group. He went on to become a bishop in Africa, but here he is at the heart of these conversations. So here is a picture of Diop. He was, as I said, the foremost publisher and organizer of the negritude movement through his journal, Présence Africaine. Here on the left is the first issue. Through his publishing house, also known as Présence Africaine. Here are some examples. He published all the negritude authors. This publishing house is still in existence, as is the bookstore he founded in Paris in the Latin Quarter. This is still run by his daughter, Suzanne Diop, and other family members. He was also the organizer of the famous Congresses of Black Writers and Artists in Paris in 1956 and in Rome in 1959 at Easter. I will let you interpret the Catholic imagery on this poster for yourselves. My argument in this part of the book is that Diop and this Catholic negritude more generally have really been overlooked in the intellectual history of Black internationalism, but they are really, he as a person and the Catholic strand are really remarkably influential in the 1950s and 60s, and they helped to push the church hierarchy through very radical critique in the era of decolonization to rethink its approaches to the peoples in its vast mission fields in Africa and elsewhere. So in chapter 3, just to orient you again, I enter the realm of theology where I am not at all at home by examining how French theologians argued in the 1950s about whether colonization was encouraged or discouraged by Catholic teachings. I center the public debate between Father Joseph Michel, pictured here, a young Puritan priest who served as a chaplain to oversee students who came to study in Paris, and Vincent Ducatillon, pictured here, an older Dominican with ties to the settler community in Algeria. Michel shocked many in the French church hierarchy when he delivered a lecture in Paris in 1954 based on the writings of Francisco de Vitoria's 16th century writings, claiming that France had a, quote, duty to decolonize. Ducatillon responded in public fashion and argued instead that Vitoria's writings justified colonization. Their debate caused a huge deal of uproar in the Franco-African Catholic world that I described in the 1950s, and shows how Catholics were fractured over this question. In my 4th chapter, I take a fresh look at the French-educated African elite that played a key role in political decolonization in Africa. And here are African and students from Africa and from the French Caribbean who were studying in France in the 1950s. And their chaplain, Father Michel, who I just spoke about, is pictured at the back left. And I would argue, in fact, I do argue, that Michel's positions were very much influenced by the experiences of the students under his care. I want to point out that the African students who went to France either for secondary or university education in the 1950s were disproportionately Catholic. That means that the numbers of them that were Catholic, the percentage that were Catholic, was much higher than the percentage of Catholics in Africa as a whole. And indeed, 7 of the 14 heads of state in Francophone Africa after independence, the wave of independence in 1960, 7 of them were Catholics. Again, much higher, much more represented than in the population at large. Despite the fact that so many of these students were Catholic, their sort of Catholicness has been overlooked, or they've been considered to be conservative or moderate in political orientation. Scholars of students have tended to focus most closely on those who were card-carrying communists or radical socialists. I show instead how radical African Catholic students in France used their faith to denounce colonialism and racism, and to push their French mentors to do the same. And I do this by doing a deep dive into the social history of their lives in France, how hard it was to get by financially as an African student in Paris, how they encountered withering racism, trying to rent rooms from French Catholic networks, no less. And here's where Michel, I think, really his consciousness was really opened up when he was trying to help his students find housing and having doors slammed in their face. and how they often felt isolated and bewildered in the metropole, and frankly, many of them scandalized by how their French counterparts weren't devout at all. So moving on to chapter 5, titled Men of Transition, it explores the experience of the first large cohort of African clergy that rose to posts in the hierarchy in French Africa. And yes, of course, there were pioneers that had come much earlier, but I would argue that a critical mass of people only emerged in force in the early 1940s. In this chapter, I point to a complex picture of attitudes and orientations. These people cannot be summed up, and their positions and attitudes cannot be summed up in, one or two sentences. And here I have some pictures of seminarians in what is now Burkina Faso in the 1940s. Paul Zumgrana, who became the first cardinal from French Africa, is seated on the ground in the front. Some of the African seminarians and clergy found the racism in missionary institutions in Africa in the 40s and 50s to be unbearable, and some French missionaries agreed with them 100%. For example, in this photograph that you're looking at, French priests belonging to the White Fathers missionaries in Upper Volta in Burkina asked their headquarters in France whether they could relax rules around their congregation's rules with regard to eating together. They were supposed to eat only with each other and observe certain practices at mealtimes. But this meant that the African clergy serving alongside them, people who were not part of the missionary congregation, had to sit at a separate table, which smacked of discrimination and segregation. The leadership in France pushed back on the missionaries who asked for this accommodation, because they were worried about the congregation losing its special character. So there was tension there. On the other hand, there were some African clergy who remained very close to, and sometimes remarkably different, to French mentors or superiors. The Vatican, however, I explore in this chapter how the Vatican started to push missions harder and harder and harder to promote African individuals, to positions of importance, especially as independence neared. And this rankled some European missionaries who did not want to obey Black superiors. Of course, African Catholics welcomed and celebrated appointments of African archbishops in the former colonial capitals. And very briefly in passing, Bernardin Gantin, who was this first generation of prelates to be promoted to archbishop in French Africa, he went on to a career in the Vatican, and he was the one who signed the order excommunicating Lefebvre many years later, which I think is there's a remarkable irony there. In chapter 6, I'm mindful of my time here, I look at debates among Catholics, both French and African, about their relationship to Muslims and Islam in Africa, which was also a pressing question as independence loomed. Lefebvre, like I said, who was the most powerful prelate, was a fierce critic of Islam and equated it to communism and to slavery in public writings in the 1950s. Touching off a fierce backlash from Muslims, but also from African Catholics who knew that, who knew they were going to have to live in harmony with Muslims in Africa, and who argued that Catholics and Muslims were actually natural allies in the African future. And those African Catholics were joined by rebellious French Dominicans in Lefebvre's archdiocese, notably Luc Moreau, who started a cross-faith prayer group between Muslims and Christians in Dakar in defiance of Lefebvre. Getting to the end. My final chapter looks at how the French Anti-Slavery Society, which had been a key organ of Catholic fundraising for Africa, changed its messaging and its identity as the colonies moved towards independence. The society's focus on slavery and, frankly, on what had been billed as African depravity in general, which had been articulated at the height of the colonial scramble in the late 19th century, seemed very out of place by the 1950s. So the society, I explore how the society renamed itself and repositioned itself as an aid organization to French missionaries in Africa. So the book thus includes a variety of interventions about Black internationalism, about late colonialism and decolonization, and obviously about the history of the church. And I concluded by arguing that decolonization is a crucial backdrop for understanding the Second Vatican Council. Conservative colonial points of view, most famously espoused by Marcel Lefebvre, clashed there with a new vision of the church as a truly universal institution, not one aligned exclusively with Europe, that was more accepting and open to people of other faiths, including Islam, and that argued that that Catholicism was a faith that could incarnate itself in all cultures, not just a European framework. And here I'm showing some of the newly appointed archbishops who came to Vatican II in the early 60s. So I'm going to pass the baton to Father Gabriel, who has real expertise on the Second Vatican Council, I think deeper than mine. And I look forward to his comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Father Gabriel.
So let me just actually thank you again, Dr. Foster. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, the audience. I'll just go straight on to my text and I'll read it. Unfortunately, I think actually my accent perhaps I think will not allow you to get everything I'm going to say, but I'll try my best. I begin my point number 1, praise for the book. Let me begin by acknowledging that Professor Foster, Dr. Foster, deals with the sensitive material in an equally elusive historical context, commendably illustrated by impressive and rich endnotes. The material includes, but not limited to, African Catholicism, colonialism, racism, a fledgling local church and newly independent states, all at the same time, arguably an incredibly challenging undertaking. Furthermore, the diverse actors in this pastoral straddle not only national, institutional, religious, cultural, racial, academic, but also ideological and social divides, to name just these, offer a fodder for either a successful and life-giving narrative or simply for a doomed account in the opposite direction. Based on my modest interaction with the book, I feel confident in concluding that the work overcomes all these major contours with notable success. In addition, regardless of the sensitivities and complexities in which the research moves, it indisputably stands out amongst the existing works in the area in the Franco-African Catholic world. My point number 2, I would now like to highlight aspects of the book that particularly strike me based on my background, both as a student of theology and history of the African Church. The book seems to favor a methodological style that emphasizes individuals separately, in pairs or in groups, in its development. In the process, I will hopefully point out strengths, raise possible areas for clarification, and any other points of interest. Point number 3, first, individual players. Alioune Diop, who has been mentioned, a Senegalese convert to Catholicism from Islam, became the leading layperson of the African movement and diaspora in France, Europe, in his formative years. However, in my judgment, his contribution to Catholicism in its complex phase in Africa and beyond, namely the African diaspora, has not always received the credit it deserves, and I think that came out very clearly. Indeed, it has been vastly underestimated. However, this book makes a great effort to highlight Diop's more accurate contribution as a bridge builder between different groups, that is intellectual, religious, national, etc. His leadership qualities are evident not only in the founding of the renowned political and literary review, Présence Africaine in Paris in 1947, but also in numerous academic conferences or congresses organized by him on various issues directly touching the embryonic future of Africa as a whole. In fact, the book also debunks some inaccurate theories about him, such as those supported by the Guadeloupean French writer Daniel Maximin and the Guinean playwright Condeto Nenekali Camara. Point number 4, Monsignor Marcel Lefebvre, the French Spiritan, is the second notable character I treat here. The book paints the picture of a clergyman who played various important roles in Africa in equally important times of the fledgling independent continent. A careful narrative contained in this book painstakingly paints a picture of a man who will eventually go from the highest placed church leader in Africa to excommunication. But it is the personal evaluation of his situation that brings out his personality. Dr. Foster quotes him, and I quote, "I continued to do what I had always done up until the council. What had earned me nominations as Archbishop, Apostolic Delegate, Spirit and Superior General, Assistant to the Pontifical Throne, and to be received every year by Pope Pius XII, who, had he lived, would have made me a cardinal." End of quote. The details contained in this book shed light, a lot of light actually, on his future difficulties with the church, without which this relationship can easily be misunderstood. Number 5, secondly, I will now move on to individuals in pairs. The first point I would like to focus on has a philosophical flavor. This is nothing but negritude and personalism. If the former is largely linked to Léopold Sédar Senghor and Alioune Diop, two Senegalese luminaries, the second is instead inspired by Emmanuel Mounier, French philosopher. The book offers extensive background on the two topics, the three characters, and the impact of their personalities on the formative years of nascent Catholicism in Africa in general. Both themes are instrumental in shaping African Catholicism. Number 6, the second point follows the same framework as the previous one, except that its point of view is slightly political in nature. Léopold Sédar Senghor, who became the first president of the newly independent Senegal, tried to create a nation that was inspired by negritude and Catholicism or Christianity. Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea-Conakry instead had a strong propensity for the Africanization of Christianity with left-wing orientations. It is a relationship that largely reflects the path the continent took in its early days and after decolonization. Number 7, the debate on whether to decolonize or not is next. Joseph Michel and Joseph Vincent Ducatillon, Puritan and Dominican priests, respectively, represent opposite directions here. The center of their controversial debate is based on the 16th century Dominican Francisco de Vitoria and the question of whether to decolonize or not. The book does well to link this debate to the reaction of the African students in the colonies against Father Ducatillon. Also of interest here is Monsignor Lefebvre's position disadvantaging decolonization, which brings him closer to Father Ducatillon in opposition to Father Michel. Point number 8. Another important point concerns the White Fathers, their charism, and how they are represented in their relationship with Islam in the chapter 4 of Friend. Importantly, in the effort to bring religions closer together, Importantly, in the effort to bring religions closer together, a certain Sheikh Mohammed Sharif, prefect of Kankan in Senegal, stood out in his sincere effort to cultivate an authentic relationship with Catholics. However, I believe more could have been said about traditional African religion, as it seems to me that it is somewhat confused with animism. Point number 9, the slavery and anti-slavery narrative is sensitive. I believe that much more needs to be done to shed more light. Monsignor Paul Sungrana's 1962 letter on the persistence of slavery in Africa, particularly in his country of Upper Volta, requires important nuances even in today's Africa. There's evidence that religious women, both African and French, played an important role in this area. I have no doubt that today their role is still very much valid, obviously mutatis mutandis. Point number 10, excuse me. The books by Présence Africaine are slightly examined. The Prêtre Noir, S'interroge, and Personnalité Africaine et Catholicisme. But given the role they play in the development of African Christian theology, more could have been said in that direction. Point number 11, Vatican II. Several contributions are highlighted. I mentioned here the names of Alion Diop in Personnalité Africaine et Catholicisme, and the following prelates: Hyacinthe Katnotiandoum, Dakar, Raymond Marie Chidimbo Conakry, Bernard Ganta, Cotonou, Bernard Yago, Abidjan, Paul Zungrana, Ouagadougou, to mention only these, but more could have been said based on their contribution by the so-called voter or wishes for the council. Of note, is the contribution of Monsignor Louis Durier Wahigoya Upper Volta, who himself was actually a white father missionary, but who became a bishop there. Of course, John the 23rd's place was at the center of these developments. Finally, Professor Foster's words are telling as she concludes the book. I quote just part of that quotation. I'm not quoting the full quotation. Indeed, the Franco-African Catholic world described in this book continues to exist today despite ruptures and new dynamics. End of quote. But that continues, and I think it has a lot more to say about what she also actually related about when she was speaking earlier. So those are the few points I thought I may want to bring to the discussion, please.
Thank you so much for excellent commentary, Father Mmassi. And it looks like we have about 15 minutes left, so I propose to go right to questions. I see 2 on the Q&A. Have you seen those, Dr. Foster?
Okay, yes, I can address those. Let me say thank you first to Father Gabriel for his really thorough engagement, and there is a lot more to say, and things some of the things maybe I can respond to as we go. So one question, 2 questions in the chat pertain to sort of the sample size, like why did I focus on Francophone Africa and not Africa in general? Why did I not focus more closely, for example, on Cameroon, which was a trust territory under French? It was under a trust territory under the United Nations. It had been a German colony, and then after the First World War was a League of Nations mandate. divided between British and French mandates, and then became a trust territory under the United Nations. So the question of what are the boundaries of this? So, I mean, part of it is my own expertise. I'm actually not, I did not train as a historian of the Catholic Church or religion. I trained as a historian of France and Africa. And I won't go into it. We don't have time for the narrative of how I got here, but it was through archives, really. And so that's what I kind of, that is the sphere I know best. I also discovered in the course of doing this, I did think about doing French and British Africa more broadly, but then I felt like it just became so complex, and like the story was spinning out of control. And I didn't really feel like there was this coherent Francophone Catholic world that deserved my attention, and whose story I could tell. But definitely, you know, I could have done something broader. The other really interesting case would be to bring in the Portuguese context, where the narrative is slightly different. The Portuguese state had been sort of ambitious. The Portuguese colonial states had been sort of ambivalent about missions until in the 40s, the Vatican signed a concordat, which meant that the Portuguese church and Portuguese, as opposed to Africans, prelates remained in control in Portuguese colonies for a much longer time. They're in a different timeline of decolonization for both church and state. But part of this is just my own expertise and what felt doable. Cameroon is a very interesting case. And one of the things, if you noticed on my slide, I'm not going to mess around with it now because we don't have a lot of time. You may have noticed when I did the numbers of African clergy, Cameroon was way ahead in terms of African clergy. And one of the reasons it's been floated that this is the case is because there's so many different languages in Cameroon, and that missionaries became reliant earlier and this also may have had to do with the transition between French and German personnel, but became reliant earlier on African catechists and on African personnel because they could not reach people otherwise. And so Cameroon is, I mean, there are many things about Cameroon that hold true for my larger story, but it also has particularities. The other particularity being that Cameroon had that separate status as a trust territory, although it was administered there were many ways in which the administration felt very colonial to people on the ground. Should I keep going with the questions in the chat?
Maybe you could take up that third one.
Yes. So the rationale of figures like Lefebvre and Ducatillon to resist decolonization. I'll actually start with Ducatillon. Ducatillon interpreted Vittoria. There's part of Vittoria's teachings said that all of the resources of the earth should be open to all of the earth's people, and that no one should be blocked from developing or making use of the resources of the earth for the good of humanity as a whole. And so Ducatillon based his argument along this line of thinking, which it aligns with rationales of other colonial powers or examples you may have heard in other contexts, and the American settler context, where the Native Americans aren't using the land, therefore we Europeans should come in, or we settlers should come in and make use of it. It's a similar argument. So Ducatillon argued that the peoples in the colonies had not been exploiting resources, effectively for the benefit of humanity as a whole, and so colonization was therefore justified along these lines. That was sort of the kernel of his argument. I'm simplifying. Lefebvre was of the opinion that Africans were just not ready for independence. They were not ready to govern themselves. They were not ready to govern the church. He thought that if the French left Africa, that there would be a descent into communism and chaos. And he very famously, as I alluded to, equated Islam publicly with slavery, with communism. He saw this all as being all of a piece. But I think for him, it was this question of civilizing mission that we have not accomplished, that the French have a civilizing mission, that Africans are not civilized yet, and we need to stay until they are, which of course was deeply offensive, of course, to many of his African interlocutors and many African Catholics who were so frustrated because he was visible and powerful. And when he said things, he got the attention of everyone.
Okay.
Oh yes, this last question, I'm okay. Oh, or not last. Sorry, I had to scroll down. So post-war colonial policy and intriguing. Okay, so the question is, I don't know if everyone can see these.
If you like, read it out.
Okay, I'll read it out. So it says, you mentioned that post-war French colonial policy became more intertwined with the church's missions than it had been under the Third Republic. Under the 19th century mission civilisatrice, then, would you say that the church and the state had different conceptions of civilization? This actually kind of goes back to my earlier work, which is, I would say there were ways in which church and state collaborated and had similar visions in the colonial period, and ways in which they very much parted ways. And so one thing that missionaries in the colonial period found very frustrating was that administrators became very skittish around questions of conversion in French colonies when it produced intergenerational strife in particular communities, or when it caused, or when they were worried about how Muslims might react to Africans converting to Catholicism. And so missionaries constantly felt as though their civilizing mission, which of course they thought was the best kind of civilizing mission, was not endorsed by the French administration. And they would say things like, we've had to have, a military occupation in Algeria for 65 years because Muslims don't like us. Why are you not favoring, missionaries so that they can convert people? Because Catholic Africans will be sort of the best French subjects, if you will. So there was a lot of that kind of rhetoric and frustration on the part of missionaries that French officials didn't endorse their activities more wholeheartedly. And yes, I mean, this business at the very end of empire, where there's a real about face, is very ironic if you know the longer history, that just at the moment that the Vatican is thinking, we need to back away from colonial states, finally, the French state is willing to throw money at Catholic schools. And part of the reason they're doing this is a very cynical, I would argue that there might be a Republican civilizing mission that is articulated, but it's not fully funded and put into practice, shall we say, in the course of the Third Republic. Schools are very thin on the ground in French Africa. In the wake of World War II, the French are terrified that the Americans are going to I'm not joking, it's in the archives, that the Americans are going to seize French territory and make them all into trust territories under the United Nations. And so they're doing this development push. Let's do education. Let's do healthcare. Let's show that we're doing a good job of empire so they don't take it away. And that's part of what's behind funding Catholic missions, because they're already there on the ground and they are already doing this work. It's not necessarily because the French state suddenly likes Catholics, but because they are useful partners in what they want to be a rapid scale up, if that makes sense.
I think we have time there is one more question. Looks like we have about 2 minutes. If John Henry would allow it, I think we can have time for one more there.
Okay. What lessons from Africa's colonial history? Oh dear, I'm a historian, and I shy away from lessons. So, what lessons from Africa's colonial history are to be applied today to prevent neocolonialism in Africa and in the African diaspora? And I'm not sure how to answer that concisely at this moment. I think, and Father Gabriel, I don't know if you have thoughts. I would like to invite you to weigh in if you would like, because I feel like I'm talking and talking. But I think it's important to, look at. If we're thinking about decolonization, there's been so much focus on politics and, this transition in terms of states, which political actors took over from European political actors and so forth. One of the things I'm trying to do in my book is to show, decolonization is something that it's a process. It takes a long time. It impacts a plethora of institutions, and it's about mentalities and mindsets. There are so many different institutions. You could talk about military. You could talk about economic structures. Just because the political heads of state changed overnight does not mean that other power relationships, went the way of the dodo in the 1960s. And indeed, I see it as an ongoing process. I think as a historian, I'd like to see more digging into decolonization across institutions and fields, moving away from the political parties, looking at things like the church, military, economic structures. So thank you. Sorry, and now I'm over time.
Well, this is just fabulous. It's an excellent, extraordinary book. I really enjoyed engaging it, and will continue to think about it. And Father Mmassi, thank you for your penetrating commentary and giving us new dimensions to think about it, for bringing your own lifetime of expertise into the conversation. So I don't know if John Henry would like to close in any way, but we've reached the end of our time. So I thank everybody for joining us, and I wish you all the best.